the quiet streets of a small city in southern Poland, life moved slowly. The sound of distant trains whispered through the fog. Children played in narrow alleys, and women returned home as the evening crept in. But among these familiar faces, there was someone who seemed no different from the rest. Someone who greeted neighbors, even smiled at times. Yet inside, he carried a secret. A dark, unsettling secret. One that no one would discover until it was far too late. You are now listening to Sleeping Radio, where the world grows quiet and the stories come alive in the stillness of the night. It is the year 1970. The world beyond Poland is shifting in politics and culture, but here, in the industrial city of Bytom, life moves at its own pace. A rhythm set by the trams that clatter along their tracks at dusk, by the chimneys that exhale their gray breath into a gray sky, and by the boots that crunch over frosted pavements in winter. Bytom is a city of brick and shadow. Narrow courtyards hide behind rows of worn apartment blocks, their balconies leaning toward each other like neighbors trading secrets. Laundry lines sway in the wind, and in the small market square, vegetables sit on wooden stalls like stubborn bursts of color against the cold. Every morning, the same patterns repeat. Men descend into the coal mines before sunrise, their lunch pails swinging like pendulums. Women hurry to their jobs, their scarves pulled tight against the wind, their faces half hidden, but their eyes sharp with the small calculations of the day. Children play in alleys, inventing games from bottle caps, chalk, and stories half remembered from older siblings. It is a place where people know each other's silhouettes. The man who always walks with his hands clasped behind his back. The woman who pauses at the bakery window but never buys bread until Thursday. The boy who skips every third step when climbing stairs. Here, familiarity is the comfort that keeps winter's chill from sinking too deep. And yet, among these familiar shapes moves a man who somehow belongs everywhere and nowhere. He is polite, quiet, helpful in ways that never require conversation. He will hold the post office door for you without looking at your face, or help carry a sack of potatoes up one flight of stairs, never two. His height is unremarkable, his build forgettable, his clothing so ordinary that no one could describe it if asked the next day. Still, he notices everything. He knows which street lamps flicker before they steady, which gates stick when the air is damp, which staircases creak on the third step from the top. He walks in the evening, often taking the side streets, the ones with the cracked paving stones and the lingering smell of coal smoke. He never seems in a hurry, yet he always moves with a quiet purpose. Sometimes, in the half-light, you might feel as though he is matching his pace to yours. Not close enough to make you turn around, but close enough that his steps become part of your own rhythm. You wouldn't think of it as following. Not yet. Bytom has its quieter corners. Behind the garages, there's a strip of wild grass and crooked trees where children trade stickers in the summer. There's a path that curves along a rusted fence and stops abruptly, as though the city itself changed its mind about where it should end. And there's the railway cut, where fog clings to the stones, and even sound seems reluctant to pass through. On certain nights, when the air is heavy and the trams run almost empty, the quiet man pauses in these places. He is not waiting for anyone in particular, not in the way people usually wait. He is learning, testing, measuring the silence. The people of Bytom are not yet afraid, but the city is beginning to listen to itself. Small things are noticed and forgotten, noticed and forgotten again. A scarf caught on a fence, a handkerchief left on a bench, a dog that refuses to walk down a certain alley. These are dismissed as accidents, coincidences, quirks of winter. The first whispers are harmless enough. A story about a missing glove becomes a story about a petty theft, which becomes a story about a man in a hat who asked too many questions. The shape of the tale changes with each retelling, but beneath it runs a subtle current. That prickle between the shoulders when you think someone might be watching. One evening, a young woman leaves a friend's apartment earlier than she planned. Her mother expects her home before the soup cools. The fog sits low, brushing her ankles as she walks. Somewhere behind her, there's the faint echo of footsteps, in time with her own. She notices, but only as one notices the hum of an electric light. Present, but unimportant. She reaches her building. The latch turns easily. The hinges give no sound. Inside, her mother scolds her for forgetting her hat. The soup is still warm. There is laughter, the soft kind that stays in the walls. Outside, the man adjusts his sleeve and walks on. He has learned something. Not about her, but about the timing of the street, the distance between footsteps, the way the fog hides movement from the eyes, but not the ears. It is not yet a plan, but the pieces are arranging themselves. By day, nothing changes. He buys bread. He nods to the shopkeeper. He stands at the bus stop as if deciding where to go, though he already knows. By night, the city opens itself to him. Its sounds, its shadows, its patterns. No one will remember the exact night when the danger began, because it did not begin with a scream or a shout. It began quietly, in the spaces between footsteps, in the slow turning of a mind toward something it has decided it wants. And in the months to come, the name Bytom will carry a weight it never had before. A weight whispered behind closed doors, over market stalls, and in church pews, where people pray a little longer than usual. But for now, there is only the city, the fog, and the quiet man who walks it. You are listening to Sleeping Radio, and this is how it begins. It is still 1970, and winter has settled over Bytom like a heavy coat. The streets are narrower now, not because they have changed, but because the snow piles at the edges, swallowing the curbs. Every breath leaves a trace in the air, a faint ghost that fades before it reaches the next lamp post. The city is quieter in these months, the kind of quiet where you can hear a single window latch close from across the street. Coal smoke hangs low, mixing with the fog until the air feels thicker than it should. In the mornings, ice crystals coat the tram rails, catching what little light the sun offers before vanishing under the first run of wheels. People walk faster, talk less, and avoid standing still for too long. But some prefer the stillness. They watch from it. The quiet man, his name still unknown to most, spends more time outdoors now than anyone would expect in such cold. He has a habit of appearing in places without explanation. By the entrance of the market, just as it closes, near the schoolyard long after children have gone home, or leaning against the iron fence outside the church, not entering, just watching the steady flow of the faithful. He speaks to almost no one. On the rare occasion he does, it is brief, almost rehearsed. Do you need help with that? Be careful, it's icy here. His voice is calm, even friendly, but it is the kind of friendliness that ends the moment the conversation does. He never lingers. He lets people walk away first. There is an alley between two buildings on Piłsudski Street that few people use in winter. It's narrow, with walls so close you could touch both sides if you stretched your arms. Snow rarely reaches it. Instead, the ground is a patchwork of old ice and wet stone. The man has walked through this alley dozens of times. He knows every crack in the brick, every door that stays locked, every window that has been painted shut for years. One night, a woman named Elżbieta takes the alley as a shortcut. She is in her early 20s, carrying a cloth bag with groceries. She has taken this path before, though not often. That night, the sound of her boots on the stone seems louder than usual. Somewhere behind her, another pair of footsteps joins the rhythm. She glances over her shoulder, sees only the mouth of the alley and the fog beyond it. The footsteps stop when she stops. They start again when she does. She tells herself it's nothing. Perhaps another resident from the building ahead. She quickens her pace. The footsteps remain steady, neither hurrying nor slowing. When she reaches the far end of the alley, she turns sharply toward her building. Elżbieta does not speak of it. Not to her mother, not to her neighbors. In Bytom, people do not rush to share small fears, not when they can be explained away. A stray pedestrian, a coincidence, nothing more. The light above the entrance flickers once, then steadies. As she slips inside and closes the door, she hears the faintest scuff of boots just outside. They pause, and then move on. The quiet man continues his walks. He changes his routes, sometimes crossing the same street twice in an hour, sometimes vanishing for a few days, and then appearing again where no one expects him. He studies more than the streets now. He studies the people, their schedules, their habits, the small rituals of leaving and returning home. There is an old courtyard near the edge of town, surrounded by buildings with peeling paint and windows like tired eyes. It is the kind of place where laundry freezes stiff on the lines in winter and children's games echo off the walls. The man begins visiting this courtyard often, leaning in its shadowed corners. He watches as people cross it on their way to the stairwells, noting who glances behind them and who does not. One evening, a boy chases a ball across the courtyard and nearly collides with him. The man smiles faintly, returns the ball, and says nothing. The boy runs off, not frightened, but unsettled in a way he cannot name. Bytom is not yet afraid, but it is aware of small shifts in its routine, aware of eyes that sometimes seem to follow from doorways and alleys. People begin locking their doors a little earlier. Curtains are drawn tighter. And in the quiet hours after midnight, footsteps are sometimes heard where no footsteps should be. The police have nothing official to say. There are no crimes to report, no missing persons, no confirmed danger. Just whispers. Whispers that grow more certain in kitchens and market stalls. There is someone out there at night. Someone who walks too quietly, who stands too still, who watches too closely. The man walks on, his coat buttoned neatly, his gaze drifting over the city as if it belongs to him alone. And somewhere, in the space between these nights, the first thread of fear is being woven. Though no one yet knows how deep into the city's fabric it will run. By early 1971, the winter had not yet loosened its grip on Bytom. Snowmelt ran in thin streams along the curbs, freezing again at night into treacherous glass. The days were short, and the sun, when it appeared, seemed pale and unwilling. Life carried on as it always had, or so it seemed. People still hurried to work, queued at the bakery, and met at the market. But beneath the surface, the city had grown more cautious. Women walked in pairs when they could. Parents called their children inside a little earlier. In the taverns, men lowered their voices when conversation drifted toward the subject no one wanted to define. The strange figure seen on too many streets, in too many alleys, at too many hours. The quiet man had become a part of the city's background, but not in the way neighbors are. He was more like an object you pass every day without thinking, until one day you realize you've been noticing it all along. He had changed, though few would have been able to point to how. His walks grew more deliberate. He lingered longer in certain places, as if waiting for the exact moment when routine thinned into vulnerability. One March evening, the city lay under a damp fog that blurred the edges of the lamps and softened the sound of the trams. The streets were nearly empty. In a small block of apartments near the coal yard lived a widow named Maria, in her late 30s. She worked late shifts at a textile mill and returned home after dark. Her path always the same. Down Pilsudski Street, through the short cut by the garages, and into the stairwell of her building. She had taken that walk hundreds of times without incident. That night, as she approached the garages, she heard the crunch of snow behind her. Slow, measured steps. She glanced over her shoulder. A man in a dark coat followed at a distance, his face hidden by the tilt of his head. She quickened her pace. The steps did not speed up, but they did not fade either. Maria told herself she was imagining it. The fog distorted sound. Still, when she reached her building, she didn't go straight to her door. She stopped inside the entryway and listened. The outside door opened softly. A shadow moved across the frosted glass of the stairwell. The man climbed one step, then another, then stopped. She called out, not a word, just a sharp sound, the kind meant to break a silence. The shadow didn't move. Her heart pounded. She reached into her bag for her keys, keeping her eyes on the glass. Then, as suddenly as he had appeared, the man turned and descended the steps. The door closed. The echo of his footsteps dissolved into the night. Maria stood in her hallway for several minutes before moving. She didn't tell anyone at first, not because she thought it unimportant, but because she wasn't sure how to explain it without sounding paranoid. It was the next day, when she passed one of her neighbors on the stairwell, that she decided to mention it. The neighbor's face tightened in recognition. She had seen him, too, in the courtyard, watching the windows one afternoon when the children were playing. 2 stories became 4. 4 became 8. Soon there was a loose network of quiet warnings among residents. Be careful if you're walking alone. Lock the stairwell door. Avoid the garages after dark. But warnings don't stop someone who has already decided what they want. That same week, something small, so small it didn't even make it into the police records, unsettled the neighborhood. A handbag was found in the narrow alley behind the bakery. Inside was nothing valuable. A scarf, a worn wallet, a packet of tissues. The bag belonged to a young woman from the next district, last seen leaving the tram stop 2 streets away. She returned home unharmed, but couldn't explain how her bag had vanished from her shoulder. She remembered a jostle, the sense of someone brushing past her, and then nothing. To the police, it was petty theft. To the people who had been watching the quiet man, it felt like a test. He was learning how close he could get without drawing a scream, how to pass within arm's reach without being challenged, how to step into a life and then out again, leaving only enough of a mark to be remembered. The city was shifting toward unease, and he could feel it. For him, the unease was not a warning. It was an invitation. By spring of 1971, the snow had melted into the soil, and the streets of Bytom had begun to smell faintly of thawed earth and coal dust. Windows opened again, if only a crack, to let in the air that still carried a bite from the mountains. Life seemed to stretch its limbs after a long winter, but for some, the sense of relief was thin. Too thin to cover the unease that had settled into the city's bones. The quiet man remained a fixture in certain neighborhoods. Not always the same street, not always at the same hour, but in the same way a shadow might slide across a wall, shifting, yet familiar. No one could remember exactly when they first noticed him, but more and more people remembered the feeling of having been watched. It was in April, on a Friday evening, that something happened which people would still whisper about months later. On Kosciuszko Street, a young woman named Halina lived alone in a second-floor apartment. She worked as a seamstress, her days spent bent over patterns and thread. On that evening, she left her building around 8 to visit her sister in the next district. She locked her apartment but forgot, in her haste, to bolt the front entrance to the stairwell, a habit most residents followed without fail. The street was quiet when she left. A few children played marbles in the fading light. A man in a dark coat stood near the corner, his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the cobblestones. She did not recognize him, but she thought little of it. By 9 o'clock, the courtyard outside her building was empty. The lamplight pooled on the stone, and the shadows between the doors grew long. A figure slipped into the building, quiet, unhurried, as if he belonged there. Neighbors later disagreed on what they saw. One recalled a man ascending the stairs, his steps slow but steady. Another swore she heard the faint click of a door latch on the second floor, followed by silence. What is certain is that Halina's apartment door bore fresh scratches around the lock the next morning. Inside, nothing was taken, nothing obvious at least. A cup sat slightly out of place on the counter. A chair was moved an inch from where Halina remembered leaving it. The window in the kitchen, which she always kept latched, was open a finger's width. She told herself she must have moved the chair without thinking, must have left the cup there herself. But she knew, in the same way one knows when a stranger has passed too close on the street, that someone had been in her home. She mentioned it to a neighbor who muttered, "It's him." That night, Halina bolted both the apartment and the stairwell door. She kept a small pair of sewing shears on her nightstand. Elsewhere in the city, the quiet man continued his walks as though nothing had happened. He passed through markets, alleys, and tram stops, pausing to observe small details. The way a key turned in a lock, the seconds between a door opening and someone stepping inside, the sound of footsteps echoing on different floors. It was around this time that the first reports reached the police of a man following women at night. The descriptions varied, and without a crime to investigate, there was little they could do. They noted the complaints, filed them away, and went on to more pressing matters. But the city was beginning to connect the dots. The man was not just a shadow in the periphery anymore. He was a presence. And, like a presence in a dream, he could not be touched, only felt. One rainy evening he was seen again, this time near the textile mill as the late shift ended. The street lamps turned the wet pavement into mirrors, and the workers moved in small clusters toward home. Among them was a woman named Irena, who noticed him standing just beyond the reach of the light. He did not follow her, but his gaze tracked her until she disappeared around the corner. It was subtle, almost nothing. But to Irena it felt like a promise. By the end of spring, the whispers had grown into quiet certainty among those who lived in the man's unseen orbit. He was testing the edges, pushing closer, waiting for the moment when no one would stop him. And somewhere, perhaps in his own mind, that moment was already chosen. By the summer of 1971, the light in Bytom lingered later into the evening. The long shadows of the buildings stretched across the cobbled streets, and the air carried the faint scent of lilacs from the small gardens wedged between blocks. Children played until the last possible moment before being called inside, their laughter mixing with the distant hum of trams heading toward the depot. To most, it was a season of relief after the harsh winter. But for a small number of women in the city, summer did not feel safer. The man in the dark coat was still there. Less a rumor now, more a figure glimpsed too often to be chance. He no longer kept entirely to the shadows. Sometimes he walked openly, matching his pace to someone else's, then slowing to let them drift ahead, then catching up again. On a warm evening in late June, a young woman named Christina left her job at a shoe repair shop just before 9. She took her usual route home, down Świętochłowicza Street, past the old cinema, then through the quiet stretch by the ironworks. That stretch was always a little too empty at night, but it cut 10 minutes from her walk. She heard him before she saw him. The steady tap of shoes on the pavement behind her. She told herself not to turn around too quickly. She didn't want to look nervous. When she finally glanced over her shoulder, she saw him. Tall enough to be noticed. Coat buttoned even in the warm air. Face unreadable in the half-light. Christina quickened her pace. He matched it. She crossed to the other side of the street. So did he. When she reached the mouth of the alley behind her building, she made the mistake of looking back a second time. That was when he closed the distance. The first thing she felt was the shove. Not hard enough to knock her down, but enough to send her stumbling into the alley wall. Before she could speak, his hand clamped over her mouth. His other hand gripped something heavy, cold and metallic. She would later remember the dull smell of rust. The object in his other hand shifted. She didn't wait to see what it was. She ran. The sound of her footsteps echoed through the alley, joined for a moment by his, then stopping. She reached her building, slammed the door, and locked it, her breath ragged. He didn't speak. His breathing was steady, almost calm. She struggled, kicking out, twisting her body. Her shoe slipped on the damp stone, but in that movement she managed to bite his hand. It was not much, just enough to make him flinch. From her window she saw nothing. No figure retreating, no shadow moving away. Only the empty street. Christina told her neighbor immediately, and the neighbor told 2 more. By the next morning, the story had moved quickly through the district. A man in a dark coat, an attempted attack, a weapon of some kind. The police took her statement. She described him as best she could, but without a clearer view of his face, they had little to act on. They filed the report. She never saw him again, but she knew he had not gone far. For the quiet man, the failed attack was not a defeat. It was a test, like every other encounter. He had learned things, how quickly a person could be caught off guard, how far they could be pushed before they screamed, how a single moment of hesitation could decide everything. In the weeks that followed, his behavior shifted. He became bolder in some ways, quieter in others. He no longer lingered near busy streets. Instead, he watched from places with only one way in or out, the kind of places where someone could vanish into the silence before help arrived. Bytom, in its daily rhythm, kept moving. But beneath the routine, a thread of fear wound tighter. Women avoided walking alone after dark. Men found themselves scanning alleys without knowing why. And somewhere in that city, the man in the dark coat carried the memory of that night. Not as a mistake, but as the first step over a line he would never cross back. By the autumn of 1971, the leaves in Bytom had begun to curl and darken, piling in small drifts against the sides of buildings. The air carried that faint metallic edge that comes before the first frost, and the evenings seemed to arrive earlier each day. The city had adapted to the presence of the quiet man in subtle ways. People locked their stairwell doors more consistently. Fewer women walked alone at night. And yet, the man himself seemed to slip through these precautions without difficulty. He was seen less often in crowded areas, more often in the places where light and sound thinned. The edges of courtyards, the shadowed spaces between garages, the alleys where footsteps echoed differently. On the 12th of October, a young factory worker named Danuta left her shift just after 7. She told her friends she would stop at the market for bread before heading home. It was a route she had walked hundreds of times, down Wrocławska Street, across the small bridge over the drainage canal, then 2 short blocks to her building. She never arrived. The last confirmed sighting of her was by a shopkeeper who saw her walking past his window, bread in one hand, her coat pulled tight against the wind. He remembered she glanced over her shoulder once, her pace quickening slightly before disappearing from his view. When she didn't come home, her family began searching. They retraced her route, stopping to ask at shops and doorways. By midnight, they called the police. Officers checked the surrounding streets, the canal, the market. Nothing. No signs of a struggle, no dropped belongings. It was as if she had stepped out of the cold air and into the earth itself. The next morning, rumors spread quickly. Some said she had run away. Others whispered about a man in a dark coat seen near the bridge that evening, standing very still, as if waiting for something. The police interviewed several women who claimed to have been followed in the weeks prior. The descriptions varied, but one detail remained the same. A man of medium build, coat buttoned to the collar, silent. Always silent. In the absence of answers, fear bloomed. Mothers began meeting their daughters at tram stops. Friends walked each other home, even in daylight. The market, once full of idle chatter, grew quieter. People spoke in low voices, as if the streets themselves might overhear. For the man, the disappearance changed everything. It was no longer about watching, testing, or waiting. He had crossed into the act itself, and in doing so, he had found the thrill he had been circling for months. There were no witnesses, no body, no proof, only the absence of a young woman who had existed one moment and not the next. In that absence, he saw his advantage. Without evidence, there could be no certainty. And without certainty, the fear would spread even further. By the end of October, the city had taken on a different shape. The tram ride home felt longer. The streets at night seemed narrower. And in more than one household, women kept heavy objects by their beds, just in case. Somewhere in that shifting landscape, the quiet man walked, his coat buttoned, his face unreadable, blending into the flow of the city, all while carrying the knowledge that he could take someone, and no one could stop him. The year was still 1971, and the fear from Danuda's disappearance had not faded. If anything, it had deepened, sinking into the daily rhythm of Bytom like a shadow that would not lift. People no longer spoke of the quiet man as a rumor. He was now a presence they felt even when they didn't see him. In early November, the city's unease sharpened. Another woman vanished. Her name was Jadwiga, a 26-year-old schoolteacher who lived in a small apartment near the tram depot. She had left work in the late afternoon, visited a friend for tea, and begun the short walk home just before dusk. She never arrived. Her absence followed the same haunting shape as Danuda's. A last sighting by someone in passing. A mention of a man in a dark coat walking a short distance behind her. Then, nothing. No trace. No clue. 2 disappearances in less than a month were enough to break the illusion that these were isolated incidents. The whispers became open warnings, passed in hurried conversations on stairwells and in markets. Don't walk alone. Keep to the lit streets. If you see him, cross the road. The police increased patrols, especially in the evenings. Uniformed officers stood at tram stops and corners, their presence both a comfort and a reminder that something dangerous walked the same streets. But the man they sought was not the kind who could be caught by chance. He did not linger where the police were. He moved like water, always finding the empty spaces. By now, he had refined his habits. He chose women walking alone, preferably in places where the sound of their footsteps could be swallowed by the wind or blurred by passing trams. He watched them long before he approached, memorizing the way they held their bags, how often they looked over their shoulders, whether they took the same route every night. The first snow of winter fell in late November, softening the edges of the streets and muting their sounds. It was on one such night, under that quiet white cover, that the 3rd disappearance occurred. Her name was Helena, a shop clerk known for staying late to close the register and sweep the floor. On the night she vanished, she left the shop at nearly 10 o'clock, the latest she had ever stayed. The snow was still falling, and her footprints stretched alone down the street. A neighbor later told police she saw a man following Helena at a distance, his steps deliberate, never hurried. She thought about calling out, but didn't. After all, the two could have been walking in the same direction by coincidence. By the time she looked again, both were gone. This time, the fear in Bytom turned into something else. Suspicion. Women avoided not just the streets, but certain shops, certain stairwells, certain courtyards. Men found themselves eyed warily by strangers. Every unknown face was a potential threat. The quiet man thrived in this climate. The more the city feared him, the easier it was for him to move unnoticed. People saw danger everywhere, and in that noise of suspicion, he became just another shadow. December approached, and with it, the long Polish nights. The man knew this was his season. The cold kept people indoors. The early darkness gave him cover, and the snow erased the smallest of tracks. And somewhere, as the year turned toward its end, he began to imagine how far this could go. How many more could vanish before the city understood that what they feared was not just a man, but a predator who walked among them in plain sight. It was January 1972, and Bytom lay under a hard winter. Snow clung to the roofs and the edges of window ledges, and the wind carried a bite that stung the skin raw. The streets were quieter than usual, the cold keeping most people indoors. Only the trams and the occasional bundled pedestrian broke the stillness. For months, the quiet man had taken women without a trace. But now, something had shifted. The disappearances were not enough. He had learned how to take without being seen. Now he wanted to see what it was like not to hide. On the evening of January 14th, a young woman named Barbara left the textile mill after her shift. The snow underfoot was crisp, each step sounding louder than it should. She wrapped her scarf higher against her face and took the familiar route home. Somewhere near the iron bridge at the edge of the industrial quarter, she realized she was not alone. Footsteps behind her, slow, deliberate, too evenly matched to be casual. She quickened her pace. So did they. Barbara turned into a side street, hoping to cut the distance. The sound followed. And then, without warning, a sharp crack to the side of her head dropped her into the snow. The man crouched beside her, one gloved hand pressed against her mouth, the other gripping the wooden handle of a heavy tool. A hammer. The cold air turned his breath into pale clouds above her face. He didn't speak, but his eyes were fixed on hers, studying the panic, as if committing it to memory. When she stopped struggling, he stood. For a moment, the world was just the wind and the snow. Then, as though remembering where he was, he dragged her toward the darkness between two warehouses. What he didn't know was that someone had seen. A tram driver, finishing his route, had caught sight of movement in the narrow space between buildings. It was too dark to make out faces, but the shape was wrong, a limp figure being pulled. He slowed the tram and shouted. The man dropped Barbara and vanished into the shadows. The driver rushed to her. She was unconscious, her head bleeding where the hammer had struck, but she was alive. The police arrived within minutes. They found the hammer half buried in the snow, the handle worn smooth from use. No fingerprints. For the first time there was evidence. A weapon, an attack in progress, a victim who had seen her assailant. Barbara described him as medium height, dark coat, calm eyes. Too calm. The attack changed the city's fear. This was no longer a matter of whispered disappearances. This was open violence. A man who would strike in the street, in the cold, with no hesitation. New patrols were organized. Officers in plain clothes walked the streets at night, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. But the quiet man adapted quickly. He vanished from the places they expected him to be, and appeared in others without warning. The police did not release her name at first, but word spread. She had been seen leaving the tram stop alone late one night. A man in a dark coat had been standing nearby. The killings had begun, and then, only 2 weeks later, the city woke to worse news. A woman's body was found in a wooded area on the outskirts of Bytom. Snow had covered her for days, but the wounds told their own story. Blunt force to the head, and something darker in the way she had been left. By February 1972, Bytom no longer felt like a city. It felt like a trap. Every corner, every shadow, every unlit stairwell seemed to hide a threat. The snow had turned gray with soot, piled high along the curbs like the walls of a narrow corridor. The wind cut through the streets, but still the fear was heavier than the cold. The murder in the woods had shaken even those who had convinced themselves they were safe. It was no longer about being careful. It was about surviving in a place where survival could not be guaranteed. Women refused to walk home alone, no matter the distance. Parents met their daughters at work or school. Men walked with their wives, scanning every passing face. And still, the quiet man walked too. He had grown more daring. No longer content with following from a distance, he now approached, asking for the time, offering to help carry something, making small talk that felt wrong in a way that people couldn't name until later. At night, the city heard rumors of more attacks. Some were only attempts, a shove, a grab, footsteps that broke into a run. But others ended like the woman in the woods. The second body was found in March, just outside the city, near the railway embankment. She was a student, last seen leaving the library. The snow around her told a story, a sudden struggle, a blow from behind, and the dragging of her body to where it was hidden from the road. The police knew now that they were hunting a serial killer. Quietly, without admitting it to the public, they connected the disappearances, the attempted attacks, and the murders. The pattern was there. Women alone at night, struck quickly with a blunt weapon, dragged away and silenced. Patrols doubled. Officers in plain clothes tried to blend into the streets. They questioned every man who matched the vague description: medium height, dark coat, calm demeanor. But the killer had one advantage. He looked like everyone else. Ordinary. Forgettable. The press began to report on the Bytom attacker, though they did not yet call him a murderer. But in the markets and stairwells, the people used other names, darker names: the Shadow, the Night Walker, and among some, an older name began to stick: Vampire. Not because he drank blood, but because he seemed to appear from nowhere, take what he wanted, and vanish without leaving a trace. By April, the killings had created a rhythm of fear. Every few weeks, another woman was gone. Sometimes her body was found days later, sometimes never. The city began to empty earlier in the evenings. Shops closed before dark. The streets grew so quiet that even the trams felt loud. The police began to focus on a few suspects. One name came up more than once: a man in his late 30s, born and raised in Bytom, known to wander at night. He had a history: small crimes, an attempted assault years before, time in prison. He was never caught for anything worse, but his name was remembered. The quiet man did not yet know the police were closing in, but he could feel the tension in the city changing. The fear that had once made him invisible was beginning to turn into watchfulness. People were not just avoiding the streets, they were looking at who was left in them. One mistake, he knew, could end it. But mistakes are easier to make when the hunger has grown too strong. And in the spring of 1972, that hunger was pulling him toward his boldest attack yet. One that would bring him face to face with someone who would not forget his face. By May 1972, the killer's shadow hung over Bytom like a permanent cloud. The police patrols had grown tighter, but so had the fear. People no longer wondered if there would be another attack. They only wondered when. On the night of May 18th, a young woman named Barbara, not the same Barbara who had survived the earlier hammer attack, left her cousin's home just before midnight. She lived less than 10 minutes away, but she knew the streets were dangerous. She took the main road under the glow of the street lamps, her pace brisk. Halfway home, she heard footsteps behind her. Steady, unhurried, matching hers. She kept moving. The steps followed. When she turned the corner into her street, the sound quickened. She glanced over her shoulder. A man in a dark coat, his face partly in shadow. She had seen his eyes before. Calm. Too calm. Barbara was not the kind to freeze. She broke into a run. The man followed. He caught her just past the entrance to her building, grabbing her arm and swinging something heavy in his other hand. She ducked. The blow missed her head by inches. She screamed. The sound cut through the quiet street, and lights began to flick on in the windows above. A man from the second floor threw open his window and shouted. Another came rushing out of the building's front door. The attacker hesitated, just for a second, then turned to run. But Barbara, still screaming, had seen his face clearly under the lamplight. Within hours, she was giving her statement to the police. The description was precise. Combined with other witness accounts, it pointed to a single man, Joachim Knychala. When the police brought him in for questioning, he denied everything. He was calm, polite, almost amused. But in his apartment, they found a coat matching the one described by multiple victims, and hidden beneath loose floorboards. Collection of women's belongings, scarves, gloves, small personal items that had never been reported stolen because their owners had never been found. Faced with the evidence, Joachim Knychala began to talk, not in panic, but almost with pride. He admitted to the murders, the disappearances, the attacks. He described the nights, the routes, the way he chose his victims. He showed no remorse. The city's fear did not vanish overnight, but the knowledge that the man in the dark coat was gone from the streets brought a kind of fragile relief. Women began to walk home again, though still glancing over their shoulders. The trams felt safer. The alleys felt less watchful. In 1975, Knychala was convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to death. The vampire of Bytom, as he was now called in newspapers, was hanged in 1985. And so, the streets of Bytom returned to their ordinary rhythm. The trams clattered past the same corners, the market filled with the same voices, and the shadows became just shadows again. But memory is not so easily erased. In the quiet hours, when the fog drifts low over the cobblestones, some still remember the sound of footsteps matching their own. The faint click of a stairwell door, the figure in a dark coat who never hurried, never spoke, but was always close enough to touch. They say the city sleeps better now, and maybe it does. But if you walk alone at night and you feel the air shift behind you, if you hear a step too perfectly in time with yours, you might find yourself glancing over your shoulder, just to be sure, because in Bytom they learned something that winter. Evil doesn't always roar when it enters your life. Sometimes it walks quietly beside you.